David Bruce here, new episode of Soloing Secrets. This is Gary Moore, and I've had a lot of requests to feature more of Gary's music. And if you search around on my channel, you'll find a Three-For-All episode where we looked at some of his licks. Also the Chords of Gary Moore Chordplay episode where we looked at some of his chords and rhythm work. And I figured it was about time to just dive into his lead style and Soloing Secrets, because definitely Gary Moore is a legend, a essential icon on the electric guitar, influenced millions of people all over the world. And he first kind of hit the scene around 1968, and his career continued all the way to 2011, which is the year when he passed away, unfortunately. But definitely a dynamite package, biting, stinging blues rock guitarist, great licks, bending and vibrato and pivot arpeggios, and all kinds of stuff. An essential electric guitarist. So much like we've done in other episodes of Soloing Secrets, it's really beneficial, when you're looking at a guitarist, to look at their influences and study the players and, musicians that influenced them when they were younger and just kind of, starting. Because usually you'll find that they carry those influences throughout their entire career. So here's an image featuring Gary Moore's elusive influences, on the guitar and with music. Gary definitely had a very long and lengthy career. I mean, he had 18 studio albums, 9 live albums, and a bunch of compilations and stuff, not to mention working with Thin Lizzy and bands like Skid Row. And that's the 70s British Skid Row, not the American Youth Gone Wild. That's a totally different band. But the 70s, Skid Row, he worked with Coliseum and a group called Scars on the side, a whole bunch of different stuff, very prolific and lots of music in Gary's discography. So here's an image with some of the musicians and bands that he's worked with in his career. And then as far as Gary's actual soloing secrets, the things I discovered by going through a lot of his music and listening to guitar solos and fills and licks and all this stuff, those little traits and habits and certain things that just pop up in his playing. So here's an image with some of those elusive things. And of course that includes, scales that he'd like to use, major and minor pentatonic scales and hybrid pentatonics, natural minor, harmonic minor, some modes kind of creep in, open string licks, and some jazzy ideas. There's all kinds of stuff in Gary Moore's style, so check this out. And as far as the music and ideas that are shared in this lesson, I basically attacked Gary's 80s, kind of early to mid 80s solo albums, Corridors of Power and Victims of the Future and Run for Cover and some of those albums. I mean, great Gary Moore albums for sure. And I thought about hitting the 70s stuff, when he was working with Thin Lizzy. And then I thought about more recent stuff, when he was more blues kind of oriented. But really for me, when I listen to Gary Moore, the stuff that really grabs me are the, solos and licks and stuff that you're going to find on those early to, mid 80s albums. Great stuff. So with the opening jam, that's not really a Gary Moore song. I was just playing a chord progression and kind of jamming in the style of Gary Moore. So it's not really one of his songs, but that is kind of serving up, kind of the focus for this lesson. Because Gary's style definitely had lots of stock, bending licks and blues licks and stuff like that. So we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on something very specific about Gary Moore and his playing style. And that's his targeting over chord progressions and chord tone soloing. And I've actually written an entire book about this subject. It's called Target Tones. It's from Centerstream, which is through Hal Leonard. But as far as that opening jam, I'm really just playing C sharp minor, A major, to E major. And then you hear that B to C sharp slide, right back to C sharp minor. So it's a really stock progression, a 6, 4, 1, technically. We're in the key of E. But that's going to serve up a really interesting area, for this first part of this lesson. And then we're going to dive into some actual Gary Moore licks and some song examples and stuff like that. But I wanted to start with this because that's going to kind of help you see this chord tone and targeted phrasing over a chord progression. So as far as this targeted phrasing or target tones is concerned, I highly recommend diving into my book, Target Tones, because that definitely attacks this head on. But with that progression, we have 3 chords, C sharp minor, A major, E major, right? And what you don't want to do, you don't want to play C sharp minor over C sharp minor, you don't want to play A major over A and E major over E. You don't want the chord progression to dictate what you're doing. And this kind of reminds me of something I picked up from Scott Henderson, a legendary fusion guitarist. And Scott's whole thing is he's talked about, playing over chord progressions, but he doesn't like saying playing over chord progressions. He likes playing through chord progressions. So let me show you what I mean. So over C sharp minor, we can safely play the C sharp minor pentatonic scale. And it's kind of a good place to start. Right here. Over that first chord, C sharp minor. That makes sense, C sharp minor over C sharp minor. Now when the chord changes to A major, we can still use that same scale. You can kind of hear what it sounds like over that A string. Now what we're actually missing is the root. There's E and C sharp, and both those notes appear in A major, but we don't have A right there. So there's E, C sharp, B, G sharp, and F sharp. Right? So we're going to have to add that A note into the minor pentatonic. Right? And Gary loved doing that kind of stuff, where he would kind of target a minor pentatonic scale, but then sprinkle in the necessary notes that he needed. So right there, when the chord goes to A, you're going to add an A. Which you could do it right there. You could also slide into this A right there. Right? Just outside of the position. Right? Just kind of sneaking into that A note. And then also when it changes to E major, luckily that's E major pentatonic right there. So what you're going to be learning about here is how to target that one, use that one scale, but then target the notes you need over C sharp minor to make it sound like C sharp minor. Target the right notes over A to make it sound like A major. And then target the right notes over E to make it sound like E major. Right? And that's tricky, but that's kind of what's happening with that progression. So let me show you what I'm going to do here. Now I'm just going to target really basic. I'm just going to target C sharp, and then I'm going to find that A, and then I'm going to end on E. Really basic like this. There's C sharp, there's A, there's E. Just follow those roots. C sharp, A, there's the E. Like that. basic stuff, but you're thinking about, what chord am I playing over? Where's the root or the important notes for that chord? And then when it changes to the next chord, you're thinking, okay, what happened? What changed? What am I going to target now? Over the A, it's A. Over the E, it's E. And then you can start targeting thirds and fifths and stuff like that over the appropriate chords. So here's a song example so you can actually see some of this pinpointed, targeted phrasing. And this comes from Hold On to Love from Victims of the Future. And it's actually happening between the 5 and the 1 chord in the key of D minor. So it's moving from A7 to D minor as far as the chord progression. And that's signaling harmonic minor, D harmonic minor, technically. So the progression starts on A7, and then you hear it resolve to D minor. And what Gary plays is this. Really basic, melodic figure. And it's really just a 3-note phrase, that C sharp, D, and that E note. But it's the way he's phrasing it over that chord progression, because he's playing this over the A. And then he's targeting that last D note when it changes to D, because that's all going to fit over that A major chord. It's going to imply harmonic minor. Like this. You can kind of hear that resolution. It's a really strong melodic strategy right there. If you hit those really strong tones and they have, maybe some tension or resolution or something like that, it makes the things you play stand out. It jumps out at you. Like, wow, what was that? Because it sounds great over the chords you're playing over. Here's another targeted melodic phrase. This comes from the song Always Gonna Love You from the album Corridors of Power. And now we're in the key of E, but during the solo section it noticeably shifts to C. And there's this driving, C power chord to D, kind of back and forth. I'm gonna loop that with TC Electronic did a looper, and that guitar solo sounds like this. So basically we're kind of, playing off that C, and we're doing this. And it's really interesting to kind of see that it's kind of like a targeted, little piece of a chord right there. And you can think of that a couple different ways. Like you could think of that as part of C major, like a part of an arpeggio, but he's doing. And you're going to grab that G and bend that to A right there. And then do it again. Then you're doing. Then you want to start again. It's just really interesting to hear how he's lining up that guitar solo with the chords and how it kind of shifts and moves and mutates depending on what chord he's playing over. Really cool. Here's another targeted melodic phrase from the same song, Always Gonna Love You. There's some great guitar work in that song, and this is over the E section, and we're doing this. One more time. So it's really interesting because we're starting on this E, the F sharp and G, and then a hammer-on pull-off between that F sharp and G, like that. Go back to that E note, and then you're going to target that B right there at the end. That's the first half. And in the second half, we're doing right there. You're going to start on that G, do that hammer-on pull-off again, grab that E. Then you're going to sneak over here and grab A and bend that up to B, like that. It's kind of a sneaky little bend right there. And I kind of like how we're ending on that lower B and then ending on that higher B. Here's yet another targeted phrase from the same song, Always Gonna Love You, and this is really cool. So it's basically moving between E and C in this part. And over the E, you distinctly hear this D bent to E, and then you hear him race down. It's kind of a speed lick. You hear him race down this partial scale, and then when the chord changes to C, he ends on C right there. So it's something like this. One more time. So slower, we're bending this this D up to E. Then you're going to pull off that D to B. Then you're going to pull off this G to F sharp, and then E to D, and then B to A, and then F sharp to E, and then right there target C at the end like a cherry on top. So slowly. Think of the lick that Jimmy Page played in Stairway to Heaven, like that opening lick. But instead of that phrase, you know, at the end of this one, Gary's targeting that C right there. If I play that over a chord progression like this, you kind of hear how it's waiting for that last little note, you know. Kind of targets that C. You know, that's the epitome of what we're talking about there. Target tones and targeting notes appropriately over the chords and chord progression. So while I did the prep work for this episode and really analyzed Gary's playing style and listened to solos and licks and phrases, I noticed lots of things. You know, open string pull-off licks and pivot arpeggios and fast scale runs and various bending and vibrato and blues licks. But this area, these palm-muted kind of melodic phrases, is really interesting. And they popped up a lot during this period, like that early to mid-80s, you know, solo output from Gary. This comes from the song Once in a Lifetime, which is from the album Run for Cover. And I actually played a variation of this during the opening jam. We're in the key of E, and it's like this. One more time. So it's really cool, and we're palm muting our way up here. So look at that little E major arpeggio or triad right there, but you're starting on A. And then you're doing... So you got... Then you're going to grab that D sharp and bend that to E. And you're going to end on G sharp right there. You know, really tasting. I love that palm muted kind of sneaky sound. Really cool. The next palm muted example comes from Out in the Field. This is also from the Run for Cover album, and it starts with a palm muted scale run, and then it starts this melodic kind of single string idea like this. One more time. So we're going to basically walk up this scale, and we're palm muting right there. It's basically D minor. But we're doing it like that. Right there, do a hammer-on pull-off between that D and E. Go back to that C and B flat, and then you're going to start this F-E-D pull-off. And then you're going to shift up, and you're doing this shift from G back to F, and then this shift from G to A back to that G. Flat A to that D. So it's kind of an interesting, you know, sequence. Like that. And he also bar dips, I believe, on that first little pull off right there. Right there on that F note. So one more time all the way through it. The next palm muted phrase comes from the song Still in Love with You, and this is actually an old Thin Lizzy tune, and Gary appears on that version, but then Gary re-recorded this later, and I think this version actually appears on the Out in the Fields compilation, which came much later after the Thin Lizzy version. But this is something like this. One more time. And then we're in the key of A, or A minor, and we're doing... palm muted, you know, scale sequence like that, and then do it again on the next set of strings. When you get to that G, then end bending that G to A. Or the last area here is going to focus on some of his soloing from the song Still in Love with You. And this is, once again, kind of the Out in the Fields compilation version, not the Thin Lizzy version from back in the 70s. But the solo's like this. It's kind of like the opening part of that solo. One more time. That extended bending that I'm kind of targeting for this idea. So that's all A minor pentatonic right here. You can grab that D, bend it to E. And you're going to bend that D to E again. Then you're going to basically overbend that. You're going to bend that D up to F. So it's a step and a half. Up to that F. And then you want to end on D. And release that bend. That's really expressive. You're doing that. You're doing it with bending. And Gary loved doing that, where he would bend to a note and then he would bend even further and kind of milk it to another note. And in the same song, you can hear kind of a variation of that melody, an octave higher, right here. Very similar to what we just did down here, but now, and then you're walking up this B, C to D, bend that D to E, and then bend that D to F, and then return to D. Very expressive, and it definitely will catch somebody's attention when you hear that bend, and then you hear it bent even further. Really cool stuff. That's going to wrap this episode of Soloing Secrets with Gary Moore. And Gary's one of those players where his career, moved and his music changed and he morphed and mutated as a musician and an artist. And that's what artists and musicians are supposed to do. You're not supposed to stand still and just remain stagnant somewhere. You're supposed to keep, changing and challenging and moving and flowing and, pushing your music and your art forward. So with him, initially he definitely had this psychedelic kind of crazy rock blues kind of sound, back with Skid Row and some of that, late 60s, early 70s stuff. And definitely with Thin Lizzy, it definitely had more of that kind of 70s rock sound. The early to mid 80s had lots of keyboards and stuff, in his mix. But he had this very aggressive, 80s rock style and sound. I mean, he was standing toe to toe with all those 80s rock guitarists. And then somewhere around, like when the 80s moved into the 90s, he shifted gears and became more of a blues musician and kind of left the crazy rock and shred stuff behind. And it's just interesting to notice like him evolving and changing over all those years. His music changed, his playing changed, but it was still all Gary Moore, which is inspiring and really cool to notice. Like, wow, he was growing. Really cool stuff. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Nail Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content and material. Thank you.